Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The New York Times recently argued that Pope Leo XIV's first encyclical on artificial intelligence could help shift Catholicism away from what the article describes as its long-standing fixation on quote-unquote pelvic theology. It's a derisive moniker. It hits at the Church's commitment to teaching natural and theological sexual morality. Noelle Mering joins us to talk about this. Noelle is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in the Life and Family Initiative. She's also a prolific author. Noelle, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's always a joy to reconnect with you. What were your thoughts when you first came across that ludicrous piece?
Well, probably similar to yours and many people's who have a fuller understanding of the Church's teachings. You know, it struck me as a really unjust, false dichotomy, stating basically that the Church spent too much time focused on what he derisively and others have derisively called pelvic theology, as you illustrated in your opening statements, meaning issues like sex, marriage, contraception, abortion, sexual morality, and that this new encyclical was the hope was that this represented a shift back to the real issues that affect human beings, and it rests on such a profound misunderstanding of what the Church actually teaches about sexuality and why she teaches it. And I think it also reflects a very common modern error that morality is divided into two categories: private morality and public morality, and that sexual ethics get pushed into the private category. And what that does is it makes those of us who are defending the Church's perennial teachings about the dignity of the human person with regard to sexual morality, it makes us seem sort of like obsessed scolds who don't really care about actual people but just want to be meddlesome in people's private preferences. But the Church has always rejected that divide because sex is inherently social. It creates obligations. It makes us into mothers, fathers, children, dependencies. It creates emotional attachments, physical needs, vulnerabilities, families. In other words, it creates the very relationships upon which our civilization depends. And so the idea that we can sort of separate this out and tease it out from social and public justice and matters of social justice is like saying that a tree can flourish while its roots are rotting away. It just cannot hold. And that really needed to be corrected, I thought.
Well, I'm really glad for your piece on EPPC, but even before we get into a lot of the meat of what you describe, I want to ask your thoughts on. So this was my sense when I came across the piece. I think my initial sense was that this is an imagination that views the world through a particular kind of, dare I say, perversion when it comes to the sexual appetite. Because the terms like pelvic theology and sins below the waist, just the phraseology of it made me realize that, wow, this is a far cry from how the Church thinks about the human person, let alone natural law.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the interesting thing to me is that, I really think it's actually quite the opposite, that it's the sort of progressive moral imagination that really isolates the pelvic region into something that has nothing to do with anything else in life. The Catholic is much more of an integrated whole view of the human person and of our relationships. That so it really is a reductive view that the opponents of the Church have here, not the Church herself. And so I agree with you. I think that it was striking, and it really creates it sort of leaves an impression of something really dystopian to describe it that way. It's reductive, and also there's something that's really mocking about it, about not only of the Church, but of God himself and the human person who's made in his image. And her teachings flow from that anthropology that cannot be separated from the rest of her understanding of social justice.
I invite you to comment on this too. That kind of a reductionistic view of the person, you start separating the individual into particular body parts. It creates a very ugly sense of an anthropology, which unfortunately we're seeing the fruits of in society.
Yeah, that's right. And you sort of can see how all of this moral disintegration that we see happening now is really flowing from that sort of isolation of the body parts in a way. Mary Harrington, I think, talks about meat Legos, like the human person that's just reconceived as a meat Lego. And I think, that all sin and all of destruction is always a division. And it's oftentimes a division of us within ourselves. Every time we sin, we are sort of convincing ourselves and justifying ourselves, and we're not facing ourselves fully. And this seems like an extension of that same sort of disintegration that rejects sort of that the integrity and the integrated understanding of who we are to one another, and how our behavior to one another, especially in the intimacy of human relationships that is so profoundly intimate, is going to inevitably affect how we live our lives of charity, how we live our lives of vulnerability, how we understand the person's vulnerability. You know, if we want to say that we don't have duties to one another, which is basically what the sexual revolution wants to claim, then, you know, we're going to start to become disgusted when a human person needs something. And so this is profoundly antagonistic to the exact sort of understanding of social charity that I think that the progressive mentality claims the mantle of, but yet rejects all of the things that need to happen in order for that real social charity to be existent.
From there, then, please comment on the red herring that the church's obsession with sexual morality is what's fueled culture wars and distracted from the gospel.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things happening. You know, the church has had to address this and has been eager to address this because there has been a profound crisis in sexual morality. This is what the sexual revolution brought about. Same as the Industrial Revolution required the church to kind of reconcile itself with what was happening in society and to address it with a profoundly human and supernatural teaching. So the sexual revolution has really created a need for the church to address this other revolution that is profoundly hurting people, especially people who are most vulnerable, like women and children, although men certainly are harmed by it as well. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that I think is happening is that it's the world, it's not the media narrative framing, not the church, that really has an obsession over this. And so this is the thing about the church that drives a lot of people crazy who want to move beyond these teachings and want sort of this new understanding of the human person that's total license, no interior freedom, and no obligation and no interdependence. And so I think, you know, the framing is always going to be when the church comes across or is speaking about these issues because they want to reframe it as, wow, look at how meddlesome, prudish, scolding they are once again. And that's been happening for decades. I mean, this is nothing new. But then to obsess over it, to always cast it in this reductive light, and then to say that we're the ones who are obsessed with it, it's just not, it strains credulity.
It strains credulity is a very kind way of putting it. But one of the things you highlight, too, that I think is crucial is that the church doesn't just say that this particular activity has to be governed by morality. She says that because it is a deeply sacred act, and as a sacred act that begets real life, it's procreative, not just reproductive, it necessitates obligations, moral obligations. The culture does not want to engage that part of the conversation.
That's absolutely right. You know, I think the culture will kind of weigh in when there's the obvious power dynamics and violence and abuse kind of exploitation occur, like in the Me Too movement, which was a very popular cause with a progressive culture. But they're not acknowledging, I think, that there's a ton of moral collapses that have to lead to that. That the idea that you can hinge all of sexual morality on consent and let people become defined by their sexual appetites up until the point of consent is really an absurd proposition. And really, you know, truly the best way to protect the vulnerable is to have people who understand and strive to live out the church's teachings here, not people who want to rebel against them. And certainly, you know, there's a whole host of social issues that emanate out of the strength of the family. I mean, a strong family culture is one of the best predictors of social flourishing. One of the best anti-poverty initiatives is to rebuild the culture of the family. Kids who have a strong family culture tend to be happier. They tend to be less tribalistic. They tend to have a real sense of belonging, of identity, of purpose, of mission. And they tend to then replicate that same sort of relationship in their own lives. And this is what human beings need deeply to flourish. And so abandoning all these teachings and saying somehow that they're at odds with our social life is really quite absurd and I think at the enemy of our flourishing.
I'm talking with Noelle Mering. She is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in the Life and Family Initiative. She is a prolific author, and we're talking about her new piece that engages the false divide between quote-unquote pelvic theology and Catholic social doctrine. Continuing on the other side, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Noelle Mering. She's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and we're talking about the false divide between pelvic theology and Catholic social doctrine. Noelle, you were just telling us, briefly giving us an overview of just how badly society has devolved just in the last 100 years of us embracing this kind of separated, fragmented view of sexual activity and then every other aspect of social doctrine. For me personally, things I speak against constantly are the epidemic of infidelity amongst husbands, the inability of young men to rise up to become faithful husbands, and the epidemic of fatherlessness. You highlighted essentially all three. Can you please speak to that? It's been less than 100 years since the 60s, and we're reaping all of these social fruits.
Yeah, I think, well, for one thing, I think, fatherhood in general has been derided for decades.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think when I was growing up, fathers were portrayed on TV as either buffoons or malevolent,
That's right.
Malicious. And I think that's for a good reason, which is that, there's a few forces more powerful for the good than a benevolent, strong father. And, the absence of the fatherlessness that we see is a real glaring sign of that, this is harming women and children and harming them deeply when men are not there for them and faithful to their commitments, and when they've really been made to feel that they don't have a real purpose in their role as a father and a husband. So it's a great lie, and it's one that I think if you could change one lie in society, that might be have the highest impact, because that's how important it is, and it really is at the heart of what I think we need and what we all want. And instead, we're told that there's too much masculinity, or that masculinity is a problem. We don't have enough of real masculinity, which is a virtuous man. Strong man is the virtuous man. And one of the stories I highlighted, there's some. This is not a lone case either. It's really a sign of something so dystopian, I think. But there have been a series of cases where men have secretly placed the mifepristone, the abortion pills that you can get in the mail now, into a pregnant girlfriend or paramour or whomever's drink in an attempt to induce an abortion without her knowledge. And I think it's such a horror. These are such horrifying stories, but they really are go to the heart of how much our gravest injustices occur where sexuality, technology, and power kind of converge. And I think these cases are really glaring signs of that too. That this does not emanate ex nihilo. There's a bunch of things that we've abandoned in our moral imagination that can create a situation where that seems like something that men might do to women. My colleagues, and there's further moral hazards here, my colleagues at the Ethics and Public Policy Center have done fantastic research on this very issue. The Biden administration, they took away the requirements for an in-office visit associated with the abortion pill. And through their research, my colleagues found out that the adverse event rate was 22 times higher than reported by the drug company. So in the article, I talk about this case, but also this reality that, women and children are the first to disappear when our language stops understanding the profound importance of our duties to one another, particularly in the area of sex and relationship and family and marriage.
The other thing that you rightly highlight, and I'm really glad for all that, because you're completely right, and what you rightly highlight from there is, like with everything else in the church's doctrinal repository, none of its moral teachings stand in an isolated vacuum. And so getting the sexual ethics right is only part of getting the grander doctrine of anthropology and therefore social flourishing right.
That's exactly right. And again, it shows that disintegration, trying to separate things from each other, whereas the church is always encouraging us to see things more holistically. So, many of modern progressives will decry the commodification of a person in things like economics, and they like, the church's teaching in Rerum Novarum, while overlooking it entirely in the realm of sex and family. But this is really where we're seeing it happening, and happening quite painfully all over the place. I mean, I call out, I think, hookup apps that, take our desire for intimacy and exploit that desire, deform that desire. The pornography industry, which makes millions of dollars industrializing our loneliness, which we already have an epidemic of, and our inability to have interior freedom. Big pharmaceutical companies that make millions off sex-rejecting procedures that are born for confused, oftentimes young people about their gender, about their sex, and the difference between sex and gender that they think is real. The pharmaceutical companies make millions of dollars off each one of those patients. And then, of course, Planned Parenthood is probably the most powerful institutional beneficiary of all of this chaos and the kind of brokenness that is left in the kind of rejection of one person to the other, of the instrumentalizing of the another person in their most intimate capacity, meaning their bodies and their what's meant to be a full gift, treating that as an instrument. I mean, this is really an awful way to treat a human being. So it's no surprise that there's all of this chaos that emanates out of this, getting this so deeply wrong. But we need to also acknowledge that, this is right, as you said, in line with what the church has been saying at every stage of a crisis. The Industrial Revolution threatened to reduce the human person to labor, or an instrument of wage or labor. The sexual revolution reduced the human person to appetite, and the AI revolution risks reducing the human person to a machine or raw data. And at every one of these stages, the church stands very powerfully in defense of the dignity of the human person. That's at the very root and foundation of her social doctrine, that we are not raw material for the ambitions of people who might have power over us, but we are made in the image of God, and that we cannot erase the human dignity, not through the market, not through the state, not through any ideology, and not through technology. So the church is saying the same thing over and over in defense of the human person made in the image of God, and those teachings cannot be teased apart, cannot be disintegrated, and still remain in any way coherent.
Like you rightly note, therefore, if we look at all of the church's moral teachings from a cohesive standpoint, a united whole, then you start seeing that the gravest injustices of this present age actually occur where sexuality, technology, and power converge. I invite you to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing in all sorts of different ways. I mean, the abortion pill is just one example, but also I'd say in fertility. I mean, the idea of IVF and engineering the human person, sex-selective abortions, this idea that we can kind of, through our personal autonomy, curate what it means to be human, because we've let go and jettisoned sort of the purpose, human final causality, and what it means to be human. This is really the issue or the crisis, I think, of our days. And I'm not the first to say this. It is crisis of what does it mean to be human. Mm-hmm. And people are saying that, calling that out over and over again, because it really is at the root of so much of the suffering, I think, in our society, so much of the collapse. And so, there's great hope, because the human person, the nature of the person doesn't change. And the church understands that, has always stood in defense of the human person. And she proclaims that courageously again and again through any sort of attack on what it means to be human. And so it's become a crisis now, I think, because in particular the sexual revolution has such a stripping down and such a really inversion of our most intimate relationships and our most intimate identity. So it might be more of a crisis now than we've seen before, but we also see a lot of hope here, because a lot of people are seeing the terrible rotting fruits of all of these lies, and they want something different. I think a lot of young people in particular, this has just been a rather disgusting cultural propaganda that's been thrust upon them about who they are, about what relationships mean, about hookup culture, about all of this. And I think you see a lot of people wanting something different and willing to say, I reject this. I reject all these lies. I want to live a real human life deeply with another person, have a family, love God, all of the things that the church has been promoting and will always promote. So with the Pope's new encyclical, I think he's standing right directly in that same lineage that refuses the reduction of the human person.
Which brings us back to Magnificat Humanitas. The criticisms that we've seen of the document from the side of people who are otherwise faithfully Catholic is one thing, but what's been the secular reception of this?
Well, I think it's been quite striking how much the world really does, as much as she might claim that the church is irrelevant. The enduring relevance of the church, you see it, I think, in these sorts of moments, that there is sort of a lot of attention that people are giving to this document, and even if they're distorting its meaning or trying to interpret it or make it a political volleyball for their side, the world sort of stops and says, what does the pontiff say? And I think it's quite beautiful that there is some reluctance and sort of inevitable inability to disregard the universal church, ever ancient, ever new, especially in her proclamations, when there's such a new kind of crisis that is looming. we want to hear what the Pope is going to say about that, and we want to hear what the Church's perennial teachings are going to bear, how they're going to bear on this very important matter.
We have about a minute left in the program. I want to ask you to speak to all of our listeners right now. The fact that we're dealing with a secular culture that's still trying to be so fragmented in sexual morality and in light of the Holy Father's exhortation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the driving point, I think the takeaway here is the Church's teachings on sexuality are certainly not arbitrary, and they're not about private behavior. They're a part of a larger defense of what it means to be human. And every force that would reduce us into appetite, to utility, to profit, or data, the Church rejects, and rejects for great reason. And I think we can feel good confidence that we have a Church that can speak into the very relevant issues with her perennial teachings, reminding us again who we are and who we are made for. And I would encourage people to feel great confidence in that and to live it out in their lives with their families, amongst their friendships, and by witnessing to the really, truly transformative power of Christ and our obedience to him in our daily lives.
Well, thank you so much, Noelle, for your time. I greatly appreciate this.
Thank you.
My guest has been Noelle Mering, a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in the Life and Family Initiative. She's joined us to talk about the false divide between pelvic theology and Catholic social doctrine. And this is based on a piece that she wrote for the Ethics and Public Policy Center that the Catholic Herald also picked up. The reason why this conversation is crucial is because it highlights again and again that the Church is the only stalwart institutional voice that will present a cohesive, integrated, and holistic version of the moral teaching that governs human life. And if we get that right, we'll actually see sound and good social flourishing. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.